Hello, my friends, it's Indiana Holmes, and again we meet to continue reading our book, A Silent Witness. Tonight we begin with Chapter 18, A Visitor from the Stars. As I pushed open the inner door and entered the room, I conceived the momentary hope of a reprieve from the wrath to come, for I found my two friends in what was evidently a business consultation with a stranger, and was on the point of backing out when Thorndyke stopped me. "Don't run away, Howard," said he. "There are no secrets being disclosed, at least I think not. We have finished with your affairs, Mr. O'Donnell, haven't we?" "Yes, Doctor," was the answer. "You've run me dry with the exception of our own little business. Then come in and sit down, Howard, and let me present to you Mr. O'Donnell, who is a famous American detective and has been telling us all sorts of wonderful things." Mr. O'Donnell paused in the act of returning a quantity of papers to a large attaché case and offered his hand. "The doctor," he remarked, "is blowing his trumpet at the wrong end. I haven't come here to give information, but to get advice. But I guess I needn't tell you that." "I hope that isn't quite true," said Thorndyke. "You spoke just now of my little business. Haven't you anything to tell me?" "I have, but I fancy it isn't what you wanted to hear. However, we'll just have a look at your letter to Curtis and take your questions one by one. By the way, what made you write to Curtis?" "I saw when I inspected Maddox's will at Somerset House that he had left a small legacy to Curtis. Naturally, I inferred that Curtis knew him and could give me some account of him. It struck you as a bit queer, I reckon, that he should be leaving a legacy to the head of an American detective agency?" "The circumstances suggested possibilities," Thorndyke admitted. O'Donnell laughed. "I can guess what possibilities suggested themselves to you, if you knew Maddox. Your letter and the lawyer's announcing the legacy came within a mail or two of one another. Curtis showed them both to me, and we grinned. We took it for granted that the worthy testator was foxing, but we were wrong, and so are you, if that is what you thought. You assumed that the will was not a genuine one. Yes, we thought it was a fake, put up with the aid of some shyster to buff us out into giving up Mr. Maddox as deceased. So, as I had come across about these other affairs, Curtis suggested that I should look into the matter, and a considerable surprise I got when I did, for the will is perfectly regular, and so is everything else. That legacy was sort of a posthumous joke, I guess. Then, do I understand that Mr. Curtis was not really a friend of Maddox?" O'Donnell chuckled. "Not exactly a friend, Doctor," said he. "He felt the warmest interest in Maddox's welfare, but we weren't, or they weren't, what you might call bosom friends. The position was this. Curtis was the chief of our detective agency. Maddox was a gentleman with whom he had been looking for and not finding for a matter of 10 years. At last he found him, and then he lost him again. And then this legacy, I take it, was a sort of playful hint to show which hole he'd gone down." "Was Maddox in a hiding all that time?" asked Thorndyke. "In hiding?" repeated O'Donnell. "Bless your innocent heart, Doctor. He had a nice convenient studio in one of the best blocks in New York, a couple of doors from our agency, and he used to send us cards for his private views. No, sir, our dear departed friend wasn't the kind that lurks out of sight in cellars and garrets. It was Maddox, sure enough, that Curtis wanted, only he didn't know it. But I guess I'm fogging you. I'd better answer the questions that you put to Curtis. First, do we know anything about Maddox? Yes, we do. But we didn't know that his name was Maddox until a few months ago. Isaac Van Dam was the name we knew him by, and it seems that he had one or two other names that he used on occasion. We now know that the gay Isaac was a particularly versatile kind of crook, and a mighty uncommon kind, too. The Lord be praised, for if there were more like him, we should have to raise our prices some. He wasn't the kind of fool that makes $1 million coup and then goes on the razzle and drops it all. That sort of man is easy enough to deal with. When he's loaded up with dollars, everybody knows it, and he's sure to be back in a week or two with empty pockets, ready for another scoop. Isaac wasn't that sort. When he made a little pile, he invested his winnings like a sensible man and didn't live beyond his means. And the only mystery to me is that when he died, he didn't leave more pickings. I see from his will, which I've had a look at, that the whole estate couldn't have been above $5,000. He had a lot more than that at one time. He may have disposed of the bulk of his property by gift just before his death, Jervis suggested. That's possible, agreed O'Donnell. He'd escaped the death due that way. However, to return to his engaging little ways, his leading line was penmanship, that is to say, forgery, and he did it in an absolute finish. He was the most expert penman that I have ever known, but where he had us all was that he didn't only know how to write another man's name, he knew when to write it. I reckon that the great bulk of his forgeries were never spotted at all, and of the remainder, very few got beyond the bare suspicion that they were forgeries. In the case of the few that were actually spotted as forgeries, his tracks were covered up so cleverly that no one could guess who the forger was. And how did you come to suspect him eventually? Thorndyke asked. Ah, said O'Donnell, there you are. Every crook, even the cleverest, has a strain of the fool in him. Isaac's folly took the form of suspicion. He suspected us for suspecting him. We didn't, but he thought we did, and then he started to dodge and make some false clues for us. That drew our attention to him. We looked into his record, traced his little wanderings, and then we began to find things out. A nice collection there was, too. By the time we had worked a month or two at his biography, forgeries, false notes, and at least 2 murders that had been a complete mystery to all of us. We made ready to drop on Isaac, but at that psychological moment, he disappeared. It looked as if he had left the States, and as we had no great affection for extradition cases, we let the matter rest more or less, expecting that he would turn up again, sooner or later. And then came this lawyer's letter of yours, announcing his decease. Of course, Curtis and I thought he was at the old game again, that it was a bit of that sort of extra caution that won't let well alone. So, as I was coming over, I thought I'd just look into the affair as I told you, and to my astonishment, I found everything perfectly regular. The will properly proved, the death certificate made out correctly, and the second certificate signed by 2 doctors. Did you go into the question of identity? Asked Thorndyke. Oh, yes. I called on one of the doctors, a man named Batson, and ascertained that it was all correct. Batson's eyesight seemed to be none of the best, but he made it quite clear to me that his late patient was certainly our friend Isaac, or Maddock. So that's the end of the case. And if you want to go into it any further, you've got to deal with a little pile of bone ash, for our friend is not only dead, he's cremated. That's enough for us. We don't follow our clients to the next world. We are not so thorough as you seem to be. You are flattering me unduly, said Thorndyke. I am not so thorough as that. But our clients, when they betake themselves to the happy hunting ground, usually leave a few of their friends behind to continue their activities. Do you happen to know what Maddock's original occupation was? Had he any profession? He was originally an engraver, and a very skillful engraver, too, I understand. That was what made him so handy in working the flash note racket. Then he went on stage for a time, and he didn't do badly at that, but I fancy he was more clever at making up and mimicry than at acting in the dramatic sense. For the last 10 years or so, he was practicing as a painter, chiefly landscape, though he could do a figure subject or a portrait at a pinch. I don't fancy he sold much or made any great effort to sell his work. He liked painting, and the art covered his real industries, for he used to tour about in search of subjects, and so opened fresh ground for little operations that actually produced his income. Was his work of any considerable merit? Thorndyke asked. Well, in a way, yes. It was rather in the American taste, though Maddock was really an Englishman. Our taste, as you know, runs to technical smartness and novelty of handling, and Maddock's work was very particular and remarkably smart and slick in handling. He used the knife more than the brush, and he used it uncommonly cleverly. In fact, he was unusually skillful in many ways, and that's the really surprising thing about him when one considers his extraordinary-looking paws. What was there peculiar about his hands? Asked Thorndyke. Were they noticeably clumsy in appearance? Clumsy, exclaimed O'Donnell. They were more than that. They were positively deformed. A monkey's hands would be delicate compared with Maddock's. They were short and thick like the paws of an animal. There's some jaw-twisting name for the deformity that he suffered. Bronchodactylius, or something like that. Brachydactylius? Suggested Thorndyke. That's the word. And I dare say, you know that sort of paw I mean. It didn't look a very likely hand for a first-class penman and engraver of flash notes. But you can't always judge by appearances. And now, as to your other question, you ask what Maddock was like in appearance. I can only give you the description which I gave to Batson and which he recognized at once. Had he noticed the peculiarity of his hands? Inquired Thorndyke. Yes, I asked him about it, and he remembered having observed it when he was attending Maddock. Well, then, our friend was about 5'9" in height, fairly broad and decidedly strong, of medium complexion, with gray eyes and darkish brown hair. That's all I can tell you about him. You haven't got his fingerprints, I suppose? No, he was never in prison, so we had no chance of getting them. Was he married? He had been, but some years ago his wife divorced him, or he divorced her. Latterly, he lived as a bachelor. There's nothing else that you can think of as throwing light on his personality or explaining his actions? Nothing at all, Doctor. I've told you all I know about him, and I only hope the information may be more useful than it looks to me. Thank you, said Thorndyke. Your information is not only useful, I expect to find it quite valuable. Reasoning, you know, Mr. O'Donnell, he continued, is somewhat like building an arch. On a supporting mold, the builder lays a number of shaped stones, or voussoirs, but until the voussoirs are there, it is a mere collection of stones, incapable of bearing its own weight. Then you drop the last voussoir, the keystone, into place, and the arch is complete. And now you may take away the supports, for it will not only bear its own weight, but carry a heavy superstructure. That's so, Doctor, said O'Donnell. But if I may ask, is this all gratuitous wisdom, or has it any particular bearing? It has this bearing, replied Thorndyke. I have myself been for some time past engaged metaphorically in the building of an arch. When you came here tonight, it was but a collection of shaped and adjusted stones, supported from without, and with your kind aid, I have just dropped the keystone in its place. That is what I mean. The American thoughtfully arranged the papers in his case, casting an occasional speculative glance at Thorndyke. I'd like to know, he said presently, what it is that I told you. It doesn't seem to me that I have produced any startling novelties. However, I know it's no use typing to squeeze you. or trying to squeeze you. So I'll get back to my hotel and have a chew at what you've told me." He shook his hands, and with all of us around, we shook hands too. And when Thorndyke had let him out, we heard a bustling downstairs and away up King's Beach Walk towards Mitre Court. For a minute or more after his departure, none of us spoke. Thorndyke was apparently ruminating on his own newly acquired information. And Jervis and I were on the statement that had so naturally aroused the detective's curiosity. At length, Jervis opened the inevitable debate. "I begin to see a glimmer of daylight through the case of Septimus Maddock, deceased," said he. "But it is only a glimmer, whereas from what you said to O'Donnell, I gather that you have the case quite complete." "Hardly that, Jervis," was the reply. "I spoke metaphorically, and metaphors are sometimes misleading. Perhaps I overstated the case, so we will drop the metaphor and state the position literally in terms of good, plain, schoolboy logic. It is this. We had certain facts presented to us in connection with Maddox's death. For instance, we observed that the cause of death was obscure, that the body was utterly destroyed by cremation, and that Jardine, who was an unofficial witness to some of the formalities, was subsequently pursued by some unknown person with the unmistakable purpose of murdering him. Those were some of the observed facts, and the explanation of those facts was the problem submitted to us. That is to say, we had to connect those facts and supply others by deduction and research, so that they should form a coherent and intelligible sequence, of which the motive for murdering Jardine should form part. Having observed and examined our facts, we next propose a hypothesis, which shall explain them. In this case, it would naturally take the form of a hypothetical reconstruction of the circumstances of Maddox's death. The hypothesis must, of course, be in complete agreement with the facts known to us, including the attempts to murder Jardine. Then, having invented a hypothesis which fix our facts completely, the next stage is to verify it. If the circumstances of Maddox's death were such as we have assumed, certain antecedent events must have occurred, and certain conditions must have existed, we make the necessary inquiries and investigations, and we find that those events had actually occurred and those conditions had actually existed. Then it is probable that our hypothesis is correct, particularly if our researches have been brought to light nothing that disagrees with it. With our new facts, we can probably amplify our hypothesis, reconstruct it in greater detail, and then we have to test and verify afresh in its amplified and detailed form. And if such new tests still yield an affirmative result, the confirmation of the hypothesis becomes overwhelmingly strong. It is, however, still only hypothesis, but perhaps we light on some final test which is capable of yielding a definite answer, yes or no. If we apply that test, the crucial experiment of the logicians, and obtain an affirmative result, our inquiry is at an end. It has passed out of the region of hypothesis into that of the demonstrative proof, and we are to understand, asked Jervis, that you have brought Maddox's case to the stage of complete demonstration? No, answered Thorndyke. I am still in the stage of hypothesis, and when O'Donnell came here tonight, there were 2 points which I had been unable to verify, but with his aid, I have been able to verify them both, and now I have a complete hypothesis of the case, which has been tested exhaustively and has answered to every test. All that remains to be done is to apply the touchstone of the final experiment. I suppose, said Jervis, you have obtained a good many new facts in the course of your investigations? Not a great many, replied Thorndyke. And what new data I have obtained, I have, for the most part, communicated to you and Jardine. I assure you, Jervis, that if you would only concentrate your attention on the case, you have ample material for a most convincing and complete elucidation of it. Jervis looked at me with a wry smile. Now, Jardine Howard, said he, why don't you brush up your wits and tell us exactly what happened to the late Mr. Maddock, and why some person unknown is so keen on your vile body? You have all the facts, you know. So you tell me, I retorted. But this case of yours reminds me of those elaborate picture puzzles that used to weary my juvenile brain. You had a hateful of irregular shaped pieces, which, if you fitted them together, made a picture. Only the beggars wouldn't fit together. A very apt comparison, said Thorndyke. You put the pieces together, and if they made no intelligible part of a picture, you knew you were wrong, no matter how well they seemed to fit. On the other hand, if they seemed to make parts of a picture, you had to verify the result by finding pieces of exact shape and size of the empty spaces. That is what I've been doing in this case, trying the data together and watching to see if they made the expected picture. As I have told you, O'Donnell's visit found me with the picture entirely saved except for 2 empty spaces of particular shape and size, and from him I obtained 2 pieces that dropped in neatly into those spaces and made the picture complete. All I have to do now is to see if the picture is a true representation or only a consistent work of imagination. I take it that you have worked the case out in pretty full detail, said Jervis. Yes. If the final verification is successful, I shall be able to tell you exactly what happened in Maddock's house, what was the cause of his death, and I may say that it was not that given in the certificates. Who the person is who has been pursuing Jardine, and what is his motive, together with a number of other very curious items of information. And the mention of that person reminds me that our friend has been disporting himself in public, contrary to advice and to what I thought was a definite understanding. But surely, I said, it doesn't matter now. We have given that spy chappie the slip. And even if he hasn't given up the chase as hopeless, we know that he's quite harmless. Harmless! Exclaimed Thorndyke. Why, my dear fellow, he was your guardian angel. Didn't you realize that from Father Humperdinck's statement, he shadowed you so closely that no attack on you was possible? In fact, he actually caught a rap on the head that was apparently meant for you. You were infinitely safer with him at your heels than alone. But given the other fellow the slip too, I urged. We have given him the slip, right? We mustn't take that for granted, said Thorndyke. The French detective, you remember, came on the scene quite recently, whereas the other man has been with us from the beginning. He probably saw Jervis and me enter the mineral water works on the night of the fire, for he was certainly there, and he may have even followed us home to ascertain who we were. There are several ways in which he could have connected you with us and traced you here, so I must urge you most strongly not to venture out of the precincts of the temple for the next few days. In fact, it would be much wiser to keep indoors altogether. It will be only a matter of days unless I get quite unexpected setbacks, for I hope to have the case finally completed in less than a week. And when I do, I shall take such action as to give your friend some occupation other than shadowing you." "Very well," I said. "I will promise not to attempt again to escape from custody, but all the same, my little jaunt today was not entirely without result. I have picked up a new fact, and a rather curious one, I think. What should you say if I suggested that Mrs. Samway was the wife of that eccentric artist who used to paint on the heath? The man, I mean, who always worked in gloves." "I have assumed that she was in some such relation to him," replied Thorndyke, "but I should like to hear the evidence." "Mrs. Samway," Jervis said in a reflective tone, "isn't that the handsome, uncanny-looking lady with those mongoose eyes who reminded me of Lucrezia Borgia?" "That is the lady. Well, I met with a portrait of her today, which was evidently the work of the man with the gloves. And here I gave them a description of the portrait and of the account of the odd way in which it had been disinterred from the landscape that had been painted over, to which they both listened with close attention. 'It's a queer incident,' said Thorndyke, 'and quite dramatic. If one were inclined to be superstitious, one might imagine some invisible agency uncovering the tracks that have been so carefully hidden, and working unseen in the interests of justice. But haven't you rather jumped to your conclusion? The existence of the portrait establishes a connection, but not necessarily that of a husband and wife. I only suggested the relationship, but it seemed a likely one, as the portrait had been painted over and thrown into the rubbish box." Jervis laughed sardonically, and even Thorndyke's impassive face relaxed into a smile. "Our young friend," said the former, "doesn't take as favorable a view of married state as one might expect from a gay Lothario who breaks out of his cage to go philandering, but will overlook that, in consideration of the very interesting information that he has brought back with him. Not that it conveys very much to me. It is obviously a new piece to fit into our puzzle, but I'm hanged if I see, at the moment, any suitable space to drop into. I think," said Thorndyke, "that if you consider the picture as a whole, you will soon find a vacant space, and while you are considering it, I will just send off a letter, and then we had better adjourn this discussion. We have to catch the early train to Maidstone tomorrow, and that, I hope, will be the last time. Our case ought to be disposed of by the afternoon." He seated himself at the writing table and wrote his letter, while Jervis stared into the fire with a cognitive frown when the letter was sealed and addressed. Thorndyke laid it on the table while he went to the lobby to put on his hat and coat, and, glancing at it almost unconsciously, I noted that the envelope was of foolscap size and was addressed to the Home Office, Whitehall. The name of the addressee escaped me, for suddenly realizing the impropriety of thus inspecting another man's letter, I looked away hastily. But even then, when Thorndyke had taken it away to the post, I found myself speculating vaguely on the nature of the communication and wondered if it had any relation to the mysterious and intricate case of Septimus Maddock. All right, friends, we move on to Chapter 19, Tenebrae. The resigned composure with which I accepted Thorndyke's sentence of confinement within doors was not entirely attributable to discretion or native virtue. My resolution to follow scrupulously my principal's very pointed advice was somewhat like the ascetic resolutions formed by the gourmet as he rises replete from the banquet table. For just as the latter is in a peculiarly favorable condition for the unmoved contemplation of a temporary abstinence from food, so I, having enjoyed my little dissipation, could now contemplate with fortitude a brief period of retirement. Moreover, the weather was in my favor, being, as Polton reported when he returned, blue-nosed and powdered with snow, with a fresh supply of tobacco for me, bitterly cold, with a threatening of smoky fog from the east. Under these circumstances, it was no great hardship to sit in a roomy armchair with my slippered feet on the curb and read and meditate as I basked in the warmth of a glowing fire, though, to be sure, my reading was perfunctory enough for the triste of the surface markings of the human body. Admirable as it was, completed on very unfavorable terms with other claimants to my attention. In truth, I had plenty to think about, even if I went no further for the matter than to the events of the previous day. There was my visit to Sylvia, for instance. I had not said much to her, but what I had said had pledged me to a lifelong companionship, which was a solemn thing to reflect upon, even though I looked forward to the fulfillment of that pledge with nothing but hopeful pleasure. The dice were thrown. Of course, they would turn up sixes, every one, but still the dice were thrown. From my own strictly personal affairs, my thoughts rambled by in easy transition to the singular episode of the buried portrait, and thence to the subject of that strange palmipset. Viewed by the light of Mr. O'Donnell's revelations, Mrs. Samway's position was not all that could have been desired. She and her husband had unquestionably been closely associated with Maddock, but Maddock was, it seemed, a habitual criminal. Could this fact have been known to the Samways, or was it the cunning forger and the swindler that had sheltered himself behind their respectability? It was impossible for me to say. Then there was the strange and perplexing case of the man Maddox himself. I could make nothing of that, had not, indeed, been aware that there had been a case until Thorndyke's investigations had put me in possession of that fact. And even now, I could see nothing on which to base my suspicion, apart from the attempts on my life, which we were assuming to be in some way connected with events that had occurred in Maddox's house. The cause of the death was apparently not morbus cordis, which might easily enough be. See that the diagnosis of the heart disease was a mere guess on Batson's part. But if not morbus cordis, what was it? Thorndyke apparently knew, and seemed to hint that it was something other than ordinary disease. Could there have been foul play? And if so, were the Samways involved in it in any way? It seemed incredible, for had not Maddock himself suspected that he was in a dangerous state of health? There was certainly one possibility which I considered with a good deal of distaste, namely that Maddock had been a hypochondriac, and that Samways, or both the Samways, had taken advantage of his gloomy views as to his death to administer poison. The thing was actually possible, but I did not entertain it, for even if one assumed that poison had not been administered, at any rate, the cremation of the body was not designed to hide the traces of the crime. The Samways had nothing to do with that. The cremation had been adopted in preference to burial by Maddox's own wish. So my thoughts flitted from topic to topic with occasional interludes of surface markings, through the lazy forenoon until Polton came to lay my solitary luncheon. And after this little break in the comfortable monotony, another spell of meditative idleness set in. Polton was busy upstairs in the laboratory with some photographic copying operations, and I was disposed to wander up and look on. But my small friend politely, but very firmly, vetoed any such proceeding. On some other occasion, he would be delighted to show me the working of the great copying camera. But just now, he had a big job in hand, and he was working against time. He would prefer to be alone. He even suggested that I might attend to any stray callers and make my own tea on the gas ring so as to avoid interrupting his work. And when I had agreed to relieve him to his extent, he thanked me profusely and retired and saw no more of him. For a time after his departure, I stood at the window looking out across the wide space at Paper Buildings and the end of Crown Office Row. It was a wretched afternoon. The yellow, turbid sky brooded close upon the house roofs and grew darker and more brown moment by moment, as if the invisible sun had given the day up in despair and gone home early. A comfortless powdering of snow filtered down at intervals and melted on the pavements, along which depressed wayfarers hurried with their coat collars turned up and their hands thrust deep into their pockets. I watched them commiseratingly, reflecting on the superior advantages of being within doors and forbidden to go out. And then, having flung another scoopful of coal on the fire, I betook myself once more to the armchair, the surface markings, and idle meditation. It was some time past 4 when my reflective browsings had begun to proceed in the direction of the tea kettle, that I had heard a light footstep on the landings of someone wearing galoshes. Then a letter dropped softly into the box, and as I instantly pushed back my chair to rise, the footsteps retreated. I crossed the room quickly and opened the door, but the messenger had already disappeared down the dark staircase, and had gone so silently on his rubber soles that, though I listened attentively, I could not hear any sound from below. Having closed the door, I extracted the letter from the box and took it over to the window to examine it, when I was not a little surprised to find that it was addressed to W. M. Howard, Esquire. This was the first communication that I had received in my borrowed name, and my surprise at its arrival was not unreasonable, for of the few persons who knew me by that name, none, with the exception of perhaps Mr. Marchmont, was in the least likely to write to me. But if the address on the envelope had surprised me, the letter itself surprised me a good deal more. For though the writer was quite unknown to me, even by name, he seemed to be in possession of certain information concerning me, which I had supposed to be the exclusive property of Thorndyke, Jervis, Polton, and myself. It bore the address 29 Fig Tree Court, Inner Temple, and ran thus: Dear Sir, I am taking the liberty of writing to you to ask you for your assistance, as I happen to know that my friends, Doctors Thorndyke and Jervis, are away at Maidstone and not available at the moment, and I understand that you have some acquaintance with medical technicalities. The circumstances are these. At 5:30 today, I shall be meeting a solicitor to advise as to the action in respect of a case in which I am retained, and the decision as to our action will be vitally affected by certain issues on which I am not competent to form an opinion for lack of medical knowledge. If Dr. Thorndyke had been within reach, I should have taken his opinion. As he is not, it occurred to me to ask you if you would fill in his place on this occasion, it being, of course, understood that the usual fee of 5 guineas will be paid by the solicitor. If you should be unable to come to the consultation, do not trouble to reply, as I am going out now and shall not be returning until 5:30, the time of the appointment. I am, yours faithfully, Arthur Courtland. The contents of this letter, as I said, surprised me more than a little. How in the name of all that was wonderful had this stranger, whose very name was unknown to me, come to be aware that I had any knowledge of medicine? Not from Thorndyke, I felt perfectly sure, not from Jervis, who, notwithstanding a certain flippant facetious of manner, was really an extremely cautious and judicious man. Could it be that my principal was overseen in his trusted laboratory assistant? Was it conceivable that the suave and discreet Polton had moments of leakiness when, in an unofficial talk outside, he let drop the secrets of which his employer's unbounded confidence had made him the repository? I could not believe it. Not only did Polton appear to be the very soul of discretion, there was Thorndyke himself. He was not the man to give his confidence to anyone until after the most exhaustive proof of the safety of so giving it. Nor was he a man who was likely to be deceived, for nothing escaped his observation, and nothing that he observed was paused without careful consideration. My lethargy having been shaken off, I addressed myself to the task of preparing tea, and I listened to the homely crescendo of the kettle song. I turned the matter over in all of my bearings. By some means, this Mr. Courtland had become aware that I was either a doctor or a medical student. But by what means? Was it possible that he had merely inferred from my circumstance of my being associated with Thorndyke that I was of the same profession? That was just barely conceivable. But if I had then, as Jervis had said of Father Humperdinck, he must be a devil at guessing. As I made the tea and subsequently consumed it, I continued to ruminate on the contents of that singular letter. No answer to it required. Then, what was Mr. Courtland going to do if I did not turn up? He admitted that the issue, which seemed to be of an important one, was beyond him, and yet he had to give an answer to the solicitor, and he was prepared to pay 5 guineas for the advice of a man of whom he presumably knew nothing. That was odd. In fact, the whole tone of the letter, with its inconsistent mixture of urgency and casual trusting to chance, seemed irreconcilable with the care and method that one expects from a professional man. And there was another point. The time of the consultation was 5:30. Now, within an hour of that time, Thorndyke would be back, or even sooner if he came by earlier train, as he had done on the previous day, and Mr. Courtland must have known, since he knew whither my principal had gone, and he must have often attended assizes himself. Could he not have waited an hour? And again, had this business been sprung upon him so suddenly that he had no time to get Thorndyke's opinion? And yet, again, why had he written at all, instead of dropping in at our chambers with the solicitor, as was so commonly done by Thorndyke's clients? All of which were curious and puzzling questions, which I put to myself one by one, and had to dismiss unanswered. And then I came to the practical question, to which I had to find an answer. and which was, could I, under the existing circumstances, accede to Mr. Cortland's request to go outside the precincts of the inn I was in? I recognized absolutely this was forbidden, but I had given no actual promise to remain in our chambers, nor had I been positively forbidden to leave them. Thorndyke had advised me to remain indoors, and his advice had been given so pointedly and with so evident a desire that it should be followed, that I had not hitherto even thought of leaving our premises. But this was unforeseeable. It was an unforeseen contingency. And the question was, did it alter my position in regard to Thorndyke's advice? I think I have never been so undecided in my life. On the one hand, I was strongly tempted to keep the appointment. The prospect of triumphantly handing to Thorndyke a 5-guinea fee which I had earned as his deputy appealed to me with almost irresistible force. On the other hand, my knowledge of Thorndyke did not support the appeal. I knew him to be a man to whom a principle was much more important than any chance benefit gained by abandonment, and my inner conscience told me he would be better pleased by a strict adherence to our understanding than by the increment of 5 guineas. So my thoughts oscillated to and fro, now impelling me to risk it and earn the fee, and now urging me to keep the letter of my instructions. And meanwhile, the time ran on, and the hour of consultation approached. What decision I should have reached? In the end, it is impossible to say. As matters turned out, I never reached any decision at all, for just as the Treasury clock struck 5:15, I heard a light, quick step at our landing, and immediately after a soft but hurried knock on the door. I strode quickly across the room and threw open the door, and then I started back with an exclamation of astonishment, for the visitor, who stood in the full light of the landing lamp, was a woman, and the woman was Mrs. Samway. As I stood gazing at her in amazement, she slipped past me into the room and softly shut the door, and then I saw very plainly that there was something amiss, for she was as pale as death, and had a dreadful, frightened, hunted look, which haunts me even now as I write. She was somewhat disheveled too, and though it was a bitter evening, her plump, shapely hands were ungloved and cold as ice, as I noted when I took them in mine. "Are you alone?" she asked, peering uneasily at the door of the little office. "Yes, quite alone," I replied. She gazed at me with those strange, penetrating eyes of hers, and said in a half-whisper, "How strange you look with that beard. I should hardly have known you if I had not expected." She stopped short, and, casting a strange, scared glance over her shoulder at the dark shadows and the dark windows, whispered, "Can they see in? Can anyone see us from the outside?" "I shouldn't think so," I replied, but nevertheless I stepped over the window and drew the curtains. "That looks more comfortable at any rate," said I. "And now tell me how in the name of wonder you knew I was here." She grasped both my wrists and looked earnestly, almost fearfully, into my eyes. "Ask me no questions," she exclaimed. "Ask me nothing. But listen, I have come here for a purpose. Has a letter been left here for you?" "Yes," I replied, "asking you to go to a place in Fig Tree Court." "Good God!" I exclaimed. "How on earth?" She shook my wrists impatiently in her strong grasp. "Answer me," she exclaimed. "Answer me." "Yes," I replied. "I was to go there at 5:30. Again her strong grasp tightened on my wrist. "Humphrey," she said in a low, earnest voice, "you are not to go. Do you hear me? You are not to go." And then, as I seemed to hesitate, she continued more urgently, "I ask you, I beg you, to promise me that you won't go." I gazed at her in sheer amazement, but some instinct, some faint glimmer of understanding restrained me from asking for any explanation. "Very well," I said. "I won't go if you say I'm not to." "That is a promise." "Yes, it's a promise. Besides, it's nearly past already, so if I don't go now, the appointment falls through. And you won't go outside these rooms tonight. Promise me that too." "If I don't go to this lawyer, I shan't go out at all. And tomorrow too. Give me your word that you won't let any sort of pretext draw you out of these rooms tomorrow, or the next day, or in fact until Dr. Thorndyke says you may." For a few moments I was literally struck dumb with astonishment at her last words, and could do nothing but gaze at her in astounded silence. At length, recovering myself a little, I exclaimed, "My dear Mrs. Samway," but she interrupted me. "Don't call me by that horrible name. Give me my own name, Letita, or," she added, a little shyly, and in a soft, coaxing tone, "call me Letty. Won't you, Humphrey? Just for this once? You needn't mind. You wouldn't if you knew. I should like, when I think of my friend, the only friend that I care for, to remember that he called me by my own name when he said goodbye. You'll think me silly and sentimental, but you needn't mind indulging me just once. It's the last time." "The last time?" I repeated. "What do you mean by that, Letty? And by speaking of our saying goodbye, are you going away?" "Yes, I am going away. I don't suppose you will ever see me again. I am going out of your life." "Not out of my life, Letty. We are always friends, even if we were to never see each other again." "Are we?" she said, looking at me earnestly. "Perhaps it is so, but still, this is goodbye. I ought to say it and go, but, oh God," she exclaimed with sudden passion, "I don't want to go away from you, Humphrey, out into the cold and dark." She buried her face against my shoulder, and I could feel that she was sobbing, and though she uttered no sound, she was indeed crying. It was a dreadful situation. Instinctively, certain though I was that her grief had a real tragic basis, I could offer no word of comfort, for what was there to say? She was going clearly to a life of wretchedness, without hope of any relief or change, and without a single friend to cheer her loneliness. That much I could guess, vaguely and dimly, but it was enough, and it wrung my heart to witness her passion of grief, to be able to offer no more than the pressure of the hand. After a few seconds she raised her head and looked in my face, with the tears still clinging to her lashes. "Humphrey," she said, laying her hands on my shoulders, "I have a few last words to say to you, and then I must go. Listen to me, my dearest friend, and remember what I say. When I am gone, people will tell you things, and you will come to know others. People will say that I am a wicked woman, which is true enough, God knows. But if they say that I have done or connived at wickedness against you, try to believe that it was not as it seemed, and to forgive me for what I have done amiss. And say to yourself, this wicked woman would have willingly given her heart's blood for me. Say that, Humphrey. It is true. I would gladly give my life to make you safe and happy. And try to think kindly of me in the evil report that will reach you sooner or later. Will you try, Humphrey?" "My dear Letty," I said, "we are friends now and always. Nothing that I hear shall ever alter that." "I believe you," she said, "and I thank you from my heart, and now I thank you from my heart. And now I must go, and it's goodbye, goodbye, Humphrey, for the very last time." She passed her arms around my neck and pressed her wet cheek to mine. Then she kissed me, and turning away abruptly, walked across the door and opened it. On the landing, in the light of the lamp, she turned once more, and I saw that the hot blush that had risen to her cheek as she kissed me had faded already into a deathly pallor, and that the dreadful, frightened, hunted look had come back into her face. She stood for a moment with her finger raised warningly and whispered, "Goodbye, dear, goodbye. Shut the door now and shut it quietly." And then she passed into the opening of the dark staircase. I closed the door softly and turned towards the window, and as I did so, I heard her stumble slightly on the stair a short way down and utter a little startled cry. I was never going out to her, and I did, in fact, stand a moment or two listening, but as I heard nothing more, I moved over to the window and, drawing back the curtain, looked down on our doorstep to see her go out. My mind was a whirl of confused emotions, profound pity for this lonely, unhappy, warm-hearted woman, contended with amazement at revelation of her manifest connection with the mystery that surrounded me, and I stood bewildered by the tumult of incoherent thought, grasping the curtain and looking down on the great square stone, that I might at least catch a farewell glance at this poor soul who was passing so unwillingly out of my life. The seconds passed. A man came out of our entry and, turning to the left, walked at a rapid pace towards the Tudor Street gate. She still did not appear. Perhaps she had heard him on the stairs and was waiting to pass out unnoticed, but yet it was strange. Nearly a minute had elapsed since she started to descend the stairs. Could I have missed her? It seemed impossible, since I had come to the window almost immediately. A vague uneasiness began to take possession of me. I recalled her face and frightened eyes, and as I stared at the doorstep with growing anxiety, I found myself listening nervously, for I knew not what. Suddenly I caught a sound, a faint and vague, but certainly a sound, and it seemed to come from the staircase. In a moment I had the door open and was stealing on tiptoe out the landing. The house was profoundly silent. No murmur even penetrated from the distant streets. I crept across the landing, breathing softly and listening, and then, from the stillness below, but near at hand, came a faint, whispering sigh or moan. Instantly I sprang forward, all of a tremble, and darted down the stairs. At the first turn I saw, projecting round the angle, a hand of a woman's hand, plump and shapely and white as marble. With a gasp of terror, I flew round the turn of the staircase, and, God in heaven, she was there, huddled limply in the angle, her head resting against the baluster, and one hand spread out in her bosom. She lay so still that she might have been dead, but for the shallow rise and fall of her breast, and the wide staring eyes that turned to me with such dreadful appeal. I stooped over her and spoke her name, and it seemed to me that a pitiful little smile trembled for a moment of the bloodless lips, but she made no answer beyond faint, broken sigh, and it was only when she moved her hand slightly that overwhelmingly horror of her reality burst upon me. Then, when I saw the crimson stain upon her fingers and upon the bosom of her dress, the meaning of that terrible pallor, the sharpening features, and strange, pinched expression flashed upon me with a shock that seemed to arrest the very blood at my heart. Yet, stunned as I was, I realized instantly that human skill could avail her nothing, that I could do naught for her but raise her from the sharp edge of the stair and rest her head on my arm. And so I held her, whispering endearments brokenly, and looking as though I might, through the blinding tears, into those inscrutable eyes that gazed up at me, no longer with a stare of horror, but with a vague and childlike wonder. And even as I looked, the change came in an instant. The wide eyelids relaxed and drooped, and eyes grew filmy and sightless, and hand slipped from her breast and dropped with a thud on the stair, and the supple body in my arms shrank of a sudden and horrible limpness of death. Up to this point, my recollection is clear, even vivid, but of what followed I have only a dim confessed impression. The awfulness, the unbelievable horror of this frightful thing that had happened left me so dazed and numb that I recall but vaguely the passage of time, of what went around me in this terrible dream from which there was to be no waking. I dimly recollect kneeling by her side on the staircase, but how long I know not, holding her poor arm, her poor body in my arms, and gazing incredulously at the marble white face, now with its drowsy lids and parted lips, grown suddenly girlish and fragile, while the hot tears dropped down on her dress, choking with grief and horror and a fury of hate for the foul wretch who had done this appalling thing, who was now far away, out of reach. I see dimly still the livid marks of accursed fingers lingering yet on the whiteness around the mouth to tell me why no cry came from her and had not reached me. No sound from her had ever reached me up the stairs. The dreadful red-edged cut in the bodice mutely demanded vengeance from God and man. And then, all of a sudden, the silence is shattered by rushing feet, the clamoring of voices. Someone, it is Jervis, leads me forcibly away to our room and places me in a chair by the table. Presently I see her lying on the sofa, drowsy-eyed, peaceful, like a marble figure on a tomb, and I see Thorndyke with a strange coppery flush and something of a grim and terrible inset his calm face, showing the letter which I had left on the table. A tall stranger who hurries from the room. Anon come to two constables, that is police, with heads uncovered, carrying a stretcher. I see her laid on the sordid bier and reverently covered. The dread procession moves out through the doorway. The door is shut after it, and so, in dreadful fulfillment of her words, she passed out of my life. Wow. That was some chapter. Chapters 18 and 19 packed a punch. I hope you think so too. That was quite a climax, or the beginning of a climax to this story. I am enthralled. I don't know about you guys. I'm excited to read the next chapter. I hope you are too. I think our story is concluding soon. So, I will see you all Monday at 6 p.m. for our next reading of A Final Witness. Thank you for joining me, and love to you all. Good night.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.